The whole town of Cedar Bluff, Colorado, had turned out to watch the rich cowboy marry his mail-order bride, and the moment she stepped down from the coach in that old gray dress, half of them started to laugh. It was a bright, hard morning in the spring of 1882, and Winnie Sutton had come 2,000 miles to stand in that churchyard, and she had spent her very last coins on the coach fare, which meant she had nothing left over for the one thing a bride is supposed to have. She wore the only wedding dress she owned, and it was 30 years out of fashion, mended at the cuffs, gone soft and pale gray with age, and to the fine ladies of Cedar Bluff in their store-bought silks, it looked like something pulled off a scarecrow. They did not trouble to hide what they thought of it. The worst of them was a banker's wife named Prudence Ainsley, who ran the town's social calendar the way a general runs an army. She lifted her little folding eyeglasses and looked Winnie up and down the slow, insulting way you'd price a lame horse at auction, and then she said, loud enough to carry clear to the back of the crowd, that the poor creature must have robbed a grave for that gown, and wasn't it a pity a man as rich as Weston Cole couldn't have done a sight better than a beggar in a dead woman's dress? The laughter spread out from her like a stone dropped in a pond. Winnie stood at the bottom of the church steps with 2,000 miles of dust on her and every eye in Cedar Bluff on her, and she felt her face go hot to the roots of her hair. She did not cry. That is the first thing you need to know about Winnie Sutton, because everything that comes after grows out of it. She had been laughed at before, and worse than laughed at, and she had learned somewhere in a hard life that tears were a coin she would not spend in front of people who had not earned them. So she stood very straight in her mother's old gray dress, and she let the laughter wash over her and break, and she waited it out the way you wait out weather. And while she waited, her hands, which had sewn every careful stitch of that dress by candlelight, curled themselves slowly into fists down at her sides, and something behind her tired eyes went cool and steady and made up its mind. What none of those laughing people knew, what they could not have guessed to look at the shabby gray gown, was that they had just laughed at the wrong woman about the wrong dress. In about 90 seconds, Winnie Sutton was going to do something so quiet and so devastating that the whole churchyard would forget how to laugh. But to understand why it landed the way it did, you have to know who she was, and who he was, and how a poor seamstress from Boston ever came to be standing in that Colorado churchyard at all. Winnie Sutton was 25 years old that spring, and she had been holding a needle since she was 6. Her mother had been a dressmaker in Boston, one of the finest, the kind whose hands could take a bolt of plain cloth and a rich woman's vague wish and turn out a gown that made the wearer weep at her own reflection. Her mother had taught Winnie everything she knew, sitting beside her through 10,000 evenings, and by the time Winnie was grown, she was every bit as good with a needle as the woman who raised her, and maybe a shade better. The trouble was that being the best seamstress in a back room does not make you anything at all in the eyes of the world, and it does not pay much either. When her mother took sick that last long winter, the doctors and the medicines ate through what little the two of them had saved, and then they ate through the furniture, and then the good scissors, and at the end there was nothing left but debt and a daughter alone. On the night she died, her mother held Winnie's hand and made her promise 2 things, and Winnie kept both. The first was that Winnie would not waste her one gift stitching in the dark for women who would never know her name. The second was smaller and stranger. Her mother pressed the old gray wedding dress into Winnie's arms, the dress she herself had married in, and told her that a good dress remembers every happy day it is worn, and that Winnie must wear this one on her own wedding day so that a little of her mother's happiness could be there too. That was the dress they laughed at in the churchyard. It was not a beggar's rag pulled off a scarecrow. It was the single most precious thing Winnie Sutton owned in the whole world, and every soft, worn thread of it was her mother's hand and her mother's love, and she had carried it 2,000 miles wrapped in oilcloth against her chest, so no harm would come to it. She would have gone hungry to protect that dress, and in fact on the long journey west she more than once had. The advertisement had come to her at the lowest point, a widowed friend showing her a matrimonial paper as a sort of grim joke to cheer her up. A rancher in Colorado, it read, well established and of good character, sought a wife of sense and skill who was not afraid of a plain hard life, far from the comforts of the city. Winnie had no money, no family, and no prospects but a needle and a promise, and she looked at that little square of newsprint for a long while. Then she sat down, and in her fine, even hand, she wrote the most honest letter of her life, and she told a stranger in Colorado exactly who and what she was, and she waited to see if honesty was worth anything to anyone anymore. Weston Cole was 38, and he was the wealthiest cattleman for 40 miles in any direction from Cedar Bluff, and not $1 of it had been handed to him. That was a thing the fine ladies of the town liked to forget when they fluttered around him at the church socials. Weston had come to Colorado at 17, with a borrowed saddle and holes in both boots. And he had built what he had out of 20 years of frozen winters and dawn starts and every kind of loss a man can take on the open range and keep going. Money had come to him late and slow, and because he remembered exactly what it was to have none, it had never once fooled him into thinking it made a person worth more. He had watched a good many local girls set their caps at his cattle and his bank account, and it had soured him on the whole business of courting. The worst of them was Arabella Voss, the daughter of the biggest merchant in Cedar Bluff, a genuine beauty who had decided some years back that Weston Cole's fortune had her name on it. Arabella had chased him with a determination that would have been admirable in a better cause, and Weston had come to dread the sight of her, because when he looked at her he could see, plain as a brand, that she was measuring the size of his house and not the shape of his heart. He had grown lonely in a way that a big, empty ranch house makes a man lonely, and he had grown certain that no woman within 100 miles wanted anything of his but the money. So he had done a quiet, almost embarrassing thing. He had put a notice in a matrimonial paper back east, far from anyone who knew him, and he had asked, in plain words, for a woman of sense and skill who wanted a partner and not a purse. He got a great many letters, and most of them, he could tell in 3 lines, were written by women who had read the word well-established and heard nothing else. Then Winnie's letter came, and Weston Cole read it standing at his own kitchen table, and then he sat down and read it again, because here at last was a woman who had not mentioned his money one single time. She had written instead about her mother, and about a needle, and about a promise, and about being afraid of nothing except living a small life in the dark. He wrote her back that same night, and his hand was not quite steady, and that was the beginning of it. They had written for 4 months before he sent her passage. In those letters, Weston Cole fell in love with a woman's plain, honest mind, the way a lonely man does, all the way down, and without quite noticing it happen. He had told her the truth of himself, too, the boots with holes and the frozen winters, and the loneliness he'd never admitted to a living soul. What neither of them had done, and this matters, was send a photograph or describe their looks, because both of them had reasons of their own to fear that beauty, or the lack of it, might get in the way of the thing that was actually growing between the lines. Winnie's coach had rolled into Cedar Bluff an hour before the laughter, and the trouble had started before she ever reached the church. Word had gone around the town for a week that Weston Cole, the great catch, the man half the mothers in the county had angled at, had gone and sent away east for a bride like a man ordering a plow from a catalog. The fine ladies were offended clear to their bones, and Arabella Voss, who had spent 3 years certain that fortune would one day be hers, was something a good deal hotter than offended. It was Arabella who had organized the little reception committee at the churchyard, though she was far too clever to appear cruel herself. She had gathered the town's finest, dressed them in their Sunday silks, and set them out front to greet the famous mail-order bride, knowing full well that whatever poor creature stepped off that coach after 2,000 miles of hard travel would look like a beggar beside them. She wanted Winnie shamed before she ever spoke a vow. She wanted Weston to see his bride through the town's eyes, small and shabby and wrong, and to feel the sting of having chosen so far beneath the beauty that had been his for the taking all along. It was a cruel and clever plan, and for about a minute and a half, it worked exactly as she had drawn it up. Winnie had stepped down from the coach travel-worn and nervous, searching the crowd of strange laughing faces for the one face she had built in her mind out of 4 months of letters. She found him at the back, Weston Cole stood a full head above the crowd, still and grave, holding his hat in both hands. And when their eyes met across all those laughing people, something passed between them that neither had felt before in the flesh, only on paper. But then Prudence Ainsley lifted her little eyeglasses and made her cruel joke about grave robbing and dead women's dresses, and the laughter rolled out, and Winnie watched Weston's face go dark and confused, and she understood in a rush of cold horror that he did not yet know. He did not know about her mother. He did not know what the gray dress was. To him, in that instant, it looked like exactly what Arabella wanted it to look like. And Weston, for his part, took one step toward the crowd, with his jaw set hard, ready to shame every laughing soul in that yard, on his bride's behalf. Promise or no promise, town be damned. He never got the chance, because before he could open his mouth, Winnie Sutton lifted her chin and started walking, straight through the middle of them, and something in the way she moved made even Prudence Ainsley go quiet. Winnie did not run to Weston, and she did not run away, and she did not weep, and she did not shout. She walked, slow and steady in her mother's gray dress, right up to Arabella Voss, because she had watched the crowd long enough to know exactly who had built this little trap and lit the fuse. She stopped in front of the beautiful merchant's daughter, close enough to speak without raising her voice, and the whole churchyard leaned in to hear, because a quiet person in a loud crowd is the most interesting thing in the world. "That's a lovely gown you're wearing," Winnie told her, and she said it gently, with real attention, her seamstress's eyes moving over Arabella's expensive dress, the way a doctor's eyes move over a patient. She let a beat pass, and then she added, still gentle, that it was a genuine Worth pattern out of Paris, or meant to be, and that whoever had copied it for the Cedar Bluff market had set the left sleeve a full quarter-inch too high, which was pulling the whole bodice off true, which was why it pinched Arabella under the arm every time she lifted it, which Winnie had noticed her doing all morning. The churchyard went very still. Arabella's hand flew involuntarily to her side, to the exact spot, before she could stop it. "I could fix it for you in an afternoon," Winnie went on, and now her voice carried, clear and kind, and absolutely merciless in its kindness. She told the assembled fine ladies of Cedar Bluff that she was a dressmaker, trained by her mother, who had been the finest in Boston, and that she could see from where she stood at least 6 badly hung hems, 3 bodices fighting their own seams, and 1 bustle so poorly wired it was a mercy the poor woman could sit at all. Then she reached down and took a fold of her own shabby gray gown between her fingers, and she held it up to the light, and she said the thing that ended it. "You laughed at this dress. My mother sewed every stitch of it by hand, for her own wedding, 30 years ago, and she taught me on it, and she died this winter, and put it in my arms, and asked me to wear it today, so a little of her joy could be here with me. There is more true skill in one seam of this old gray dress than in every silk in this yard put together, and every one of you who knows cloth knows I'm telling the truth." She turned in a slow circle, and she met their eyes one by one, and not one of them could hold her gaze. "I came here poor, I'll grant you that. But I never once came here beneath you, and by this time next year, ladies, half of you are going to be knocking on my door begging me to dress you." Nobody laughed. Nobody said a word. You could have heard a pin drop into the dust of that churchyard, and Prudence Ainsley's little folding eyeglasses hung forgotten in her hand. Weston Cole crossed that silent churchyard in about 6 long strides, and what he did next mattered as much as anything Winnie had said, because a town watches how a man treats a woman when she has just made herself the center of every eye. He did not care that she had made a scene. He did not care what Prudence Ainsley thought or what Arabella Voss felt. He walked straight up to Winnie Sutton in her mother's gray dress, and he took off his hat, and he took both her travel-worn hands in his 2 big ones, and he looked at her the way a man looks at the one thing he has been waiting his whole life to find. "You're everything your letters promised and more than I dared hope," he told her, and he said it plain and loud enough that the crowd could hear every word, because he wanted them to. He said that he had fallen in love with her honest mind over 4 months of paper, and that seeing her stand in the dust and turn the whole town's cruelty back on itself without once losing her dignity, he now loved the rest of her to match. Then he turned, still holding her hands, and he faced the churchyard full of people who had laughed, and his voice went hard and quiet. He told them that this was the woman he was proud to marry, that she had more worth in her needle finger than the lot of them had in their whole bodies, and that any soul who could not be civil to her could get off his land and out of his church, and stay off both for good. Then he did the thing that undid Winnie completely, after she had stood so straight through so much. He lifted one of her hands and looked at the mended cuff of that old gray sleeve, and he asked her, gently, just for the two of them though the crowd strained to hear, whether this was her mother's dress. When she nodded, unable for once to speak, he pressed his lips to the worn gray fabric at her wrist, right there in front of everyone, and he told her it was the most beautiful wedding dress he had ever seen in his life, and that he'd be honored past all speaking to marry a woman wearing her mother's love. That was when Winnie Sutton, who had not cried through 2,000 miles and a churchyard full of laughter, finally had to put her free hand over her mouth. They were married that morning after all, in the little church, and the ceremony went forward in a silence that had entirely changed its flavor. The fine ladies who had laughed sat stiff in their pews, and Arabella Voss left before the vows, and none of it mattered a whit. There is an old line from Charlotte Bronte, from the book Jane Eyre, that Winnie had loved since her mother first read it to her by candlelight. "I am no bird," Bronte wrote, "and no net ensnares me. I am a free human being with an independent will." Winnie had crossed a continent with that line folded up in her heart, and standing at that altar in her mother's gray dress, poor and proud and finally, truly chosen, she understood at last exactly what it meant. Now, a wedding is a fine thing, but it is not a life, and the town of Cedar Bluff did not fall in love with Winnie Cole overnight just because her husband did. Respect earned in one dramatic morning has a way of leaking out again over the slow, ordinary weeks that follow, and there were plenty in town, led quietly by Arabella Voss and her wounded pride, who were more than ready to remember the beggar in the gray dress and forget the woman who had silenced them. Winnie knew it too. She had not lived a hard life without learning that the world makes you prove yourself twice, and then a third time for good measure. So she went to work, the way she had always gone to work, which was without complaint and without waiting to be asked. She turned one of the empty rooms of Weston's big, lonely ranch house into a proper sewing room, and she hung her mother's shears on the wall where she could see them, and she began, quietly, to build the thing she had promised the churchyard she would build. Her first customer was not a fine lady at all, but Tilda Boone, the widow who kept the boarding house, a broad, kind woman with a worn-out Sunday dress and no money to replace it. Winnie took that tired old dress and, over one long evening, remade it so cleverly, let out here and taken in there and trimmed with a bit of ribbon from her own small store, that when Tilda Boone put it on, she stood in front of the glass and cried, and then she went out and told every soul in Cedar Bluff who would listen. Word of a gift like Winnie's does not stay quiet long in a small town, no matter how much certain people would prefer it to. Within a month, the wives of the ranchers and the shopkeepers were finding reasons to drive out to the Cole place, shy at first, a hem to be fixed, a collar turned, and Winnie took every one of them without a word about the churchyard, and she made each of them look better than they had ever looked in their lives. She never gloated, and she never reminded anyone of the laughter, because her mother had taught her that the finest revenge a woman can take is simply to be so good at what she does that the people who doubted her have to live with having been wrong. Weston watched all this from the edges, quietly proud, falling a little more in love with his wife every week. The marriage itself, meanwhile, was growing into the thing both of them had hardly let themselves hope for from the letters. They fit. In the long winter evenings they sat together by the stove, Winnie's needle flashing and Weston mending harness or reading aloud, and they talked the way they had written, honest and easy and unafraid. The big ranch house that had echoed empty for 20 years, filled up with lamplight and low talk, and the small sounds of two people who liked each other's company, and Weston Cole, who had built a fortune and lived alone in the middle of it, discovered what it was to actually be rich. Trouble, when it came from exactly where you'd expect, because a woman like Arabella Voss does not lose gracefully, and she does not lose quietly. She had spent 3 years believing Weston Cole's fortune was owed to her, and she had been humiliated in that churchyard in front of the whole town, and she had been nursing the injury all through that first winter, like a coal she would not let go out. When she finally moved, she moved at the thing she thought Winnie could not defend, which was the marriage itself. She began a whisper, the way small, cruel people do, passed careful from parlor to parlor. She said that the whole thing had been a swindle, that this so-called seamstress had trapped a lonely rich man with a sad story and a rehearsed scene in a churchyard, that no woman honest and poor could turn a town on its head so neatly unless she had planned it, and that Weston Cole was a fool being played for his money by a scheming pauper. It was a clever poison, because it took the very moment that had won the town, Winnie's stand in the gray dress, and turned it into evidence against her. And it began, slowly, to work. Winnie felt the chill of it at church, in the shops, a coolness creeping back into faces that had begun to warm to her. Weston wanted to ride into town and put a stop to it with his fists, or his money, or both, and it was Winnie who stopped him with a hand on his arm and a plan of her own. She had learned long ago that you cannot fight a whisper with a shout, that the only cure for a lie about your character is to stand in the full light of day and let people see the truth of you so plainly that the lie has nowhere to live. So instead of hiding from the town's cooling eyes, she did the opposite. She announced, through Tilda Boone, who by now would have walked through fire for her, that she would make the gown for the wedding of the Cedar Bluff Church's own beloved schoolteacher, a poor young woman marrying a poor young farmhand, and that she would make it for free, and that all the town was welcome to come and see. Winnie Cole put 4 weeks and the whole of her mother's art into that schoolteacher's wedding gown, and when the day came, the church at Cedar Bluff was fuller than it had been for anything short of a funeral, because the whole town had come to see whether the whispered swindler or the woman in the gray dress was the true one. What they saw answered the question for good. The poor schoolteacher, a plain, thin girl who had never in her life owned a beautiful thing, came up the aisle in a gown so lovely, so perfectly made to flatter everything good about her and gently hide the rest, that a sound went through the church, a soft collective intake of breath, and half the women there had tears standing in their eyes before the girl reached the altar. It was not a rich gown. Winnie had made it out of humble cloth, because humble cloth was what there was, and that was the whole point, and everyone in that church understood it at once. Here was proof, standing at the altar in front of God and Cedar Bluff, that this woman's gift was real and freely given, that she took the plain and the poor and made them beautiful and asked nothing for it, that a person who would spend 4 weeks of her art on a penniless schoolteacher's happiness was not and could never be the cold schemer Arabella Voss had whispered her to be. The lie simply died, right there in the pews, for lack of anything true to stand on. You could feel it go. Afterward, in the churchyard where it had all begun, the fine ladies of Cedar Bluff came to Winnie Cole one by one, and this time there was no laughter. Prudence Ainsley came first, stiff and proud and clearly hating every step of it, and she stood in front of Winnie and worked her jaw a moment and finally got out that she had been wrong, that she had said a cruel thing about a dress she had not understood, and that she would consider it an honor if Mrs. Cole would consent to make her a gown, and she would pay whatever was asked. Winnie looked at the woman who had started the laughter a year before, and she did not gloat, because she never did. She simply said that she would be glad to, and that she'd start with that badly hung left sleeve that had been pinching her all this time, and the two women looked at each other, and something that was not quite friendship, but was a great deal better than war passed between them. Arabella Voss did not come. Arabella Voss, in fact, left Cedar Bluff not long after, having discovered that a town will forgive a poor woman a great many things, but will not forgive a rich one for being proven small, and that is a story for another fire. Winnie never spoke against her, never once, And somehow that was the worst punishment of all. I have always loved how this one ends, so let me tell it to you plain. Within the year, exactly as she had promised that first laughing morning, the fine ladies of Cedar Bluff were indeed knocking on Winnie Cole's door, and not to laugh. She built a dressmaking business out of that ranch house sewing room that grew until she had 3 girls working under her. Poor girls she trained the way her own mother had trained her, giving them the gift and the promise both. Brides came from 40 miles off to be married in a Winnie Cole gown, and it was said in that part of Colorado that a woman married in one of her dresses was a woman married in something that would remember her happy day forever, which is exactly what Winnie's mother had once told her about the old gray dress. She kept that gray dress her whole life. It hung in a place of honor in the sewing room, and on the birthday of each of her own daughters, and Winnie and Weston had 3 of them, she would take it down and tell the story of the churchyard, and the laughter, and the mother who sewed every stitch by candlelight, so that her girls would grow up knowing exactly what their family was made of. She taught all 3 of them the needle, of course, and she taught them the harder lesson too, the one her mother had died leaving her, which was to never let anyone tell you your worth by looking at your clothes. Weston Cole lived a long life beside her, and counted every year of it the best luck a man ever stumbled into, and he never tired of telling the story of the day the whole town laughed at his bride, and she silenced them without raising her voice. He would get to the part about the gray dress and the pinched sleeve, and his eyes would go bright, and he would shake his head and say that he had come to that churchyard the richest man in the county, and left it, for the first time in his life, actually rich, and that there was all the difference in the world between the two. Here is the thing I keep, from the story of Winnie Sutton and her mother's gray dress. The whole town looked at a shabby gown and thought they knew the whole of the woman inside it, and they were so sure of what they saw that they laughed out loud. And it took her about 90 quiet seconds to show them that they had not understood a single thing, that the thing they mocked was the very thing that made her priceless. People are forever doing that, judging the whole of a person by the least and cheapest thing about them. Now and then one of those people they underestimate turns out to be carrying her mother's love stitched into an old gray dress, and a gift that no silk can buy, and the patience to let the truth win slow. When you meet one of those, do not laugh. Take off your hat. If this one warmed you, stay a while by the fire. There are more of them coming. More women the world was so sure it had measured right, and every last one is worth the time it takes to tell.